For those of you who know me, know that I love dessert. One of my favorite memories is Thanksgiving and all the rich food that we all get to eat that time of year. And one of my favorite of those rich foods is a dessert called a 100-layer cake. Now, it's pretty much what it sounds like, although except it's not quite 100 layers, but it's a lot of nice, thin, moist layers with chocolate layering over the cake batter each time until it's covered in an amount of chocolate on the top. It's wonderful. It's great. I love every bit of it. Now, that's nice to know, but what does that have to do with this past Sunday? Because this past week, we covered the big picture, part 5, and we talked about a promise that God made to David. It's another promise in a long string of promises that God has been making throughout the Bible. And we want to make sure we highlight those and kind of catch us up to speed and find out how this latest promise ties in to all the other promises that God has given so far. If you remember, the very first promise was the one given to Adam and Eve, that a son would come, right, to crush the adversary, to restore order out of chaos in the world. A second promise was given to Abraham, that he would have a son who would have sons that would have sons, and they would become a great nation, and that nation would be a blessing to all nations in the world. God came through on that promise, and that nation was gathered around a mountain called Sinai, and God made another promise and said, if you will obey and listen to my commands, I will make you a kingdom of priests, people who will step in and intercede and speak to God for the nations and be a representative of him to the nations. And through that, they would bless the world just like he had promised Abraham. What we find when we look at these is they're not just separate promises, but one promise with multiple layers. Much like layers of my favorite 100-layer chocolate cake, God was crafting this beautiful, multi-layered promise. Here in 2 Samuel, he's just adding one more layer onto the top of that promise, right? And much like other places in the Bible that we've discussed before, there are certain words that are used to tie everything together, to help you think of those layers that have come before and help you to piece it all together, to understand that it's all one big cake and how it fits. So let's revisit a couple of small pieces of 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 through 14, and see how they tie us back to those bigger promises and start to layer this cake together, okay? 2 Samuel verse 11 says that the Lord declares to you, speaking to David, that the Lord will make you a house. We talked about how that's a dynasty, right? And when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you. Now let's pause here for just a sec, because where else do we see this word or have heard this word offspring? Maybe Genesis 3:15, right? If you remember the very first week, or excuse me, the second week in our series, we talked about Genesis 3:15, where God made that first promise and said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, talking to the adversary, and between your offspring and her offspring. He, which is a son of Eve at some point, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So an offspring of Eve who's going to crush the adversary. That's the first promise. So David is promised an offspring, which ties us back to Adam and Eve's offspring. Layer in the cake. Okay, here we go. So what else do we see? In Genesis 15:5, right? We see a word that is used again, just like it's used in 2 Samuel. In Genesis 15:5, God told Abraham, he says, and he brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven and number the stars. And if you're able to number them at all, because there's so many, then he said, so shall your offspring be. There it is again. That's not an accident, right? That's by design. God layers the cake with Adam and Eve with the offspring. He layers another offspring with Abraham. And here he's tying it together with David's offspring who would come. Abraham would have offspring that would bless or bring God's favor to the nations, right? This is all intentional. The author wants you to remember back to those first promises and hear that in this new promise. It's layering it all together. So let's keep looking in verse 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 7. God says this. He says, that offspring who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13 says, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Where's God talked about a kingdom before? Do you remember? Exodus 19:6, right? We just covered that last week, or 2 weeks before, the Big Picture Part 4. You can watch that in our YouTube series here or on Facebook as well, where we covered Exodus 19, verse 6 that says, God making this promise here, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. God is saying, I will make you a kingdom of priests, right? A holy set apart nation, a holy set apart people to be a kingdom for him. So God is making Abraham's people a kingdom of priests, right? To stand before God and to present the needs of the people. And now in this latest promise, what do we have? We have the kingdom, right? I have the offspring of David come who will be a king over a kingdom that will last forever. A son of David, a son of God. You see, God is layering this promise cake together, but he hasn't quite put the icing on it in our story yet, has he? Not quite. Almost. But we're not quite there. At this point in the narrative, we're still looking ahead, aren't we? Who is this king that's over this kingdom, that's over this people, that's going to be the son of Adam and Eve? Who's going to fulfill all of this multi-layered promise? See, God is working it out in his timing, isn't he? We want it now. We want to know the answer now. We want to be ready. We want to jump ahead. God is telling Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, and now David, one is coming. Be ready. He'll be fulfilled in my timing, not yours, but he is coming. So we look forward to seeing the arrival of a serpent-crushing, interceding, eternal king who will rule and reign over God's kingdom of blessing that will be for all the people.